Hi, everyone, and welcome back to the Connections Conference. This session is Avoiding Ethical Pitfalls in Wargaming, led by Dr. Ruby Booth. Ruby is a principal member of technical staff at Sandia National Labs in Livermore, California, where she works as a cyber systems research analyst. Her past research includes projects related to cybersecurity, risk assessment, hacker behavior, ethics, and cyber-focused decision-making. Her formal education includes a PhD in business administration, a master's in management of information systems, and a bachelor's in poetry. In addition, Ruby has 2 decades of game design experience in the hobby game industry. Ruby, welcome, and I tilt the ball over to you.
Hello, thank you so much for being here. As the little banner below says, my opinions are my own and not the opinions of Sandia National Labs or any previous employers. If I could get the slides up, please. So I come to wargaming from a slightly non-traditional path. I've done a lot of work in hobby game design and in work around human subjects research and how we use computers and technology. And so when I came into the wargaming space, I had just a little bit of different perspective, and I'm hopeful that that different perspective is useful in application to sort of the ethical pitfalls work that I'm doing now and that you're here to look at. So let me see how to get my slide. There we go. So the objective of today's conversation is I really want to stimulate discussion on ethics and motivate supporting research streams based on the broad experience of game design and in human subject research. I've come up with these concepts and I'm really looking at this from an individual sort of pondering the problem rather than having done a bunch of case studies or something like that. So I'm not reporting out about a specific game. I'm not reporting out about specific research of my own. I'm really talking about the sort of broad issues that we might have with ethics in wargaming. And I'm going to raise a few of those and we'll talk about them in detail. One of the ways that this might differ from some of the other presentations that you've seen at Connections is that I really do want this to be a conversation. And so even though I can't see you, if you are in the Discord, I can have your comments and questions. And so just as you have questions, please put them in the text and I'll make an effort to address them. And so that way we can have a little bit of a dialogue, even though we're not in the same room. This is, again, intended to stimulate thoughtful discussion and consideration of the ethical implications of our work. This is not intended in any way to say that the work that we're doing now isn't ethical or that wargaming is problematic. Rather, that this is just a space where I feel like we have some edge cases that might be questionable, and where as we move forward as a community, we have some incredible opportunities to really flesh out what it means to create war games and to make those accessible and relevant to the larger community. All of this is contextualized in terms of U.S. policies and practices related to human subjects research. I'm going to talk about things that I'm sure you're already familiar with, like the Belmont Report and an IRB processes and things of that sort. This is therefore somewhat different if you're coming from another country where your norms and laws around human subjects research may be somewhat maybe substantively different than what we do in the U.S. So that's just kind of a boundary for this talk. It's mostly concerned with the U.S. rules, but I think that a lot of the U.S. rules come from a place that we can apply to wargame design and play and research separate from just the U.S. context. This is not intended to be exhaustive or definitive. These are my thoughts and ideas around this topic. I have done a lot of thinking, but that doesn't mean that I think that I've found the one true answer to ethical wargaming. Rather, I think that we as a community can usefully have conversations about these things. And just to underscore, these are my views. They're not the views of the larger group that I'm in or of Sandia National Labs or, God forbid, the U.S. government. I do not speak for the U.S. government. So within our group, we do a lot of analytical and experimental war games. And so we look at wargaming as a data generating process. And so what do I mean by that? Well, I mean that in areas where where a lot of data don't exist, where we don't have the exhaustive background of tons of examples and a lot of pre-existing work. We can really use war games to get into these spaces that are new, whether it's cyber or whether it's use of nuclear weapons. Like we have the incredible good fortune as a world that cyber conflicts haven't been as overt as they might have been, haven't been as frequent as they might have been, and certainly even more so with nuclear. Where we have a very low end of nuclear weapons use, which we're glad about, but does mean that hypothesizing and theorizing in those spaces can be a little challenging. And so there are a lot of different kinds of data generating processes, but we do approach within our group wargaming as one of those. However, war games still are largely untested in terms of credibility as models of real conflict. Now, that doesn't mean that they can't be used, and that doesn't mean that that I'm throwing out decades and decades of war game research and saying, well, it doesn't have credibility, but rather that we have factors around wargaming that we haven't fully explored. So I'm going to sort of go through some of the considerations that people have raised and talk a little bit about how I view them. So we can capture diverse scenarios. This is something that I think is really important about wargaming. We can have a wargame that is as broad and interesting or as narrow and specific as we need it to be in order to capture some specific question. But the scenarios, sometimes we get criticism as a community that our scenarios lack realism or other kinds of validity. They're not transferable, they're not generalizable, that people aren't, that they lack some important element that is present in the real world that makes the games invalid. These are things that through additional research we can really, in testing of lab experiments and applying these things across multiple methodologies that we can address. And I think that the best way, and you'll hear me say this again and again in this talk and over the course of the week, if you see me in other talks, is the idea that we should take this head on. The idea that war games may have laboratory effects, that we may have areas where we can improve our rigor. We should just tackle it, do it. Let's do the studies as a community. Let's make a roadmap and let's find out where we're lacking validity and how we can mitigate that. And in places where we have validity, let's produce the research that and write it up such that other people can see it and can really have confidence in our results. Another thing is that we can recruit from a diverse participant pool with minimal impacts to reputation. That's great, right? So, and when I say minimal impacts to reputation, I'm really comparing this to either warfare itself or to other kinds of wargame exercises. So, for example, full-scale exercises with real troops and real, machinery of war can have great reputational impacts. I mean, they can be really powerful in for good or ill when we're looking at people's careers. And so, one of the great things about wargaming is that relative to those kinds of exercises, it's a low stakes game. I'm not saying that we don't as a community have a story or two about this person doing this in this wargame or this person doing that, but overall it's a pretty low impact compared to other things. It's not probably as low impact as something like a survey, fair enough, but the impacts to reputation are relatively low. That said, we aren't clear about players' motivations. This is something that comes up again and again in critiques of our work, that we can't track, why truly a player did this or that, and that's fair. We do have rigor checks and things like that we can do. We can ask players why they did things. We can observe the conversation, the table talk, and track those things. But there are these sort of areas where we may have a weakness that we'll need to find more information about. Finally, we hope that experimental wargaming will increase the generalizability of wargame findings. But as I'm going to talk about a bit in this talk, that in itself has ethical implications. The more successful we are in wargames and wargames application to generalizable findings or theoretical contributions, the more important some of these ethical implications are. So, I am a wargaming optimist. I think that we can do so much with wargaming. particularly with experimental wargaming, because I'm in that crew from San Diego National Labs that that originally developed games like Signal and that really created high-end data sets from a wargaming group. But even all the kinds of wargaming, qualitative wargaming, other kinds of analytical wargaming and experimental wargaming, all I think have incredible potential to allow us to really test interesting questions in conflict research. However, the downside to that is that we have all the dangers of conventional behavioral experiments on human subjects, and we get some extra ones because we're in wargaming. So that's a little tricky, and we're going to talk a little bit about that today. Just to go back to the kind of rigor that we're looking for as we design experimental war games, where we have a set war game and we have a large N data set, and we're varying some independent variable across game sets. We're looking for the usual things, right? We're looking for replicability, controllability, clear instrumentation, neutrality, and fidelity. If you want to read more about this process, you can read the Reddy et al. Paper in Science called Next Generation Wargames, if you have not already. That work goes into great detail about the opportunities and potentials that exist in experimental wargaming. So we have all the obstacles that are present in traditional behavioral experiments. And here are a few, but one of the most important ones that I like to talk about and think about within wargaming is getting appropriate samples. So we have multiple kinds of samples that we can use. We can get elite samples, we can get diverse samples, we can have paid participant. All those things give us the opportunity to run war games many times. If we can get access to multiple elite samples, then we get good information about how elites think about a particular problem. If we can get diverse samples, then we can look at how the diversity itself affects decision making. Do people from one culture solve some kind of conflict problem differently than another? Paid participants allow us to increase our N substantially, provided that we have the funding to pay them. But organizations like MTurk, tools like MTurk allow us to really get to high numbers in a way that is, now that we can deploy online, now that more and more people in the world are comfortable with online games and online interactivity, one of the unintended and potentially unexpected side effects of having a giant pandemic that was worldwide for a year and a half is that we really have access to a huge pool of people who maybe weren't comfortable with more complex online activities that now are, because everything went online. But we do have some problems, right? So first of all, getting appropriate samples can be challenging. I say we can get elite samples, but it's easy for, say, a national lab or or a military game unit or even someplace like RAND to get elite samples. But it can be harder for people who are starting out in wargaming, who don't maybe have those resources, people from other places, so non-US, non-Five Eyes groups who want to find out about the larger experimental space, about the larger sort of conceptual behaviors of different people may have some problems getting the level of elite samples that they need in the volume that they need in order to do experimental wargaming work, or even regular wargaming work. You can imagine somebody, a department in a school, in a university in America that doesn't have those connections, really struggling to get an elite sample. Similarly with diverse samples, we can sort of have that on the other end of the spectrum. Sometimes elite samples are not necessarily diverse samples, and we do have an obligation to look at a range of potential participants and figure out how these questions vary across groups. So that can be challenging. Paid participants can create a certain questionable validity. Are they really playing in order to achieve the victory conditions, or are they just playing for that paycheck? And so they act in a haphazard or unstructured manner. Finally, uninvested or inattentive participants is a huge problem. And that's a problem whether you're having participants on MTurk or you're having participants in a day-long war game where they've been compelled to play. It's easy to to forget, but so much of the credibility of war games really comes from engagement in the game itself. And so I think we've all had concerns about somebody who wasn't really paying attention to the rules, or who wasn't really focused on the victory conditions, and that can skew our results in a really troubling way. Finally, the game itself, the lab, thinking of the game itself as a lab, or as the game platform and the repeated place of the game as a lab, and then multiple iterations of an experiment. Games can drive atypical behaviors. I think we've all heard of some iteration or other of gamer's mode, or the warrior's playstyle, where people are so focused on winning that they do things that they would never otherwise do, things that are irrational in reality, but rational within the game design. And that's something that obviously we try and account for, but you still get game-breaking scenarios from time to time. And I think that that's an issue in analytical, experimental wargaming, but also in just any kind of wargaming. You get people operating outside the bounds in order to win, whether it's actually to win or to feel superior to the white cell group, or whatever it might be. And within all of this, we still have the Belmont constraints, because this is human subjects research. And we also have the presence or absence of reputational stakes can really matter in a way that that is true with behavioral experiments in general, but may have particular relevance in wargaming, where we are talking about people frequently playing, junior and senior members of the same military branch playing in a room together, and that might have effects. Yes, so I see a comment here, people often act differently when the bullets are real. This is a constant concern that we get in wargaming, and I think it's true in any experiment where we're looking at human behavior in a scenario that has life or death stakes for the individual, but not life or death stakes in the simulation. And so that's absolutely, people do act differently when bullets are real. I think that the argument that we make for wargaming is not that it is identical to war, but that it is a better model than some of the other options available to us, and that it provides insights that aren't necessarily accessible from, say, just looking at historical data, where it may be hard to get the level of granularity of individual behavior that we would like to see. And I would argue that people are more invested in, and I don't think I'm going to hear very many objections to the idea that, for instance, war games are a lot more compelling and simulate a higher level of risk than, say, a survey experiment, where people are even less committed to the stakes. If I give you a piece of paper, ask you to read a scenario and pick A, B, or C, the risks are even less than if you're playing in a group of people where you might have some reputational loss. And so, so these are all considerations that we have to make when we're designing a war game. So I've talked a lot about the fact that wargaming is human subjects research, and I've kind of elided the fact that the Belmont Report is what the Belmont Report actually consists of. I've mentioned it, but I haven't actually talked about it. So for a moment, I would like to take a little time to walk us through basically the core principles of the Belmont Report. For those of you, I'm sure that everyone on this, attending Connections knows this, but for the future audiences who may have stumbled across this on YouTube, the Belmont Report is a guideline for the protection of human subjects in research. And it's something that when we do human subjects research in America, we have to conform to the core principles. And there are three core principles: respect for persons, beneficence, and justice. So respect for persons, we actually have, we get off pretty easy in war games, because we aren't dealing with protected groups. So the two core principles around respect for persons are autonomy and protection. Autonomy, the ability of individuals to make informed decisions about their actions. So in a war game scenario, or in any kind of experimental scenario with people, you have to tell them what the research is about. There are some sort of secondary things, but in the main, you tell them what the research is about. You tell them what they're going to have to do. You tell them what they when they can leave, which is usually whenever they want, and the consequences for leaving, which is usually in any kind of approved design, is almost always nothing. And so they get to make those decisions. And then with games, actually, they have this whole extra level of autonomy because they control their play. They control their moves in the games. So I feel like we're great on autonomy. On protection, we actually are fortunate just by, we sort of sidestep that just by virtue of the kind of work that we do, although I wasn't a conversation earlier where I found out that sometimes that has not always been the case. But generally speaking, there are a few protected groups, and one of them, so there's people who have cognitive impairment such that they can't make their own autonomous decisions. There's children, there's pregnant women for the variety around health issues, and there's prisoners. And so broadly speaking, we don't have those groups, with the exception of pregnant women who may arise in our experiments. But broadly speaking, we aren't asking questions of children or people with cognitive disabilities such that they would be unable to make choices, and we aren't deploying the studies into prisons. And so as a result, we get to sidestep respect for persons, the protection side, because we're not dealing with protected groups. Not to say that they don't still need protection if they are in part of our studies. I see a question here. How differently do people behave when the impact of their decisions is on people they know versus people they do not know? This is really interesting. And I will say a couple of things. One is, I do think that there's a variation there, and you can see that in some of the reporting around war games where there were people from the same branch of the military who knew each other and who maybe had situations or personal characteristics going in, personal dynamics, social dynamics that influence play. You can even see that in war games between branches of the military or between militaries. For instance, when we do some kind of game scenario with, say, Germany, that there may be some dynamics there. But on a very fundamental level, do people make different decisions with people they know versus people they don't know? Of course we do. And so this is one of the things that we need to look at the laboratory effects of. To what extent is that difference meaningful is something that we can absolutely run studies to see. And that's an area where, again, let's face those questions head on. Let's do some research, and let's find out the answers. And so we can say we expect a certain amount of variance there. So beneficence is the second principle for the Belmont Report, and that is two central premises. One is do no harm, and the other one is maximize possible benefits and minimize possible harms. I would argue that by doing war games at all, instead of, say, large-scale military exercises or war itself, border skirmishes or something to see how a strategy might play out, we are choosing a beneficent approach. However, maximize possible benefits and minimize possible harms is something that's a little bit trickier to understand in the context of war games. What are the possible benefits of war games, and what are the possible harms? And so again, this is something, particularly when we look at reputational impacts, that I think that we, it's worthwhile for us to start exploring that space a little bit. However, the key place in the Belmont Report that I think that we have work to do is in the category of justice. Not because I'm saying that we do unjust work, but because I think that we lack an assessment of justice within our discipline and within the wargaming methodology. So the principles of justice are: to each person an equal share, to each person according to individual need, to each person according to individual effort, to each person according to societal contribution, to each person according to merit. And those aren't exclusive. It's not like you pick one. We need to do the whole thing. And so right now, it's not that I am arguing that we don't do any of these things, but I don't see that we have a systematic way of assessing and assuring that these things happen. So what does to each person an equal share mean when we're designing a war game? Individual need, when we're talking about, say, a medical procedure, makes a certain sense. Someone who is very sick might need that medical procedure, that experimental procedure, much more than someone else. But in a war game scenario, what is the need? And one of the spaces where I see us having an opportunity here is that by virtue, the nature of war games and the nature of connections and sort of our community, we tend, at least in the research that I'm doing, to look at great powers conflict. And the training that we give tend to be, we tend to have a pipeline for wargaming that is around large scale great powers conflict and individuals with areas, with training and education and job experience that relates to this. So, we have, war colleges, we have national labs, we have academia. But these things don't necessarily address individual need in the sense that there are places in the world that may need conflict research that we aren't touching on. And how are we as a community doing it, educating people outside of this space, outside of our sort of small community, so that those principles can be applied to places that are needed. Like, how do we look at failed states in wargaming? How do we look at the various concepts that can come from something other than great powers conflict? So these are areas where I feel like we have real opportunity to build out what we do, to educate and inform and find ways that these games can be used to facilitate stability and conflict resolution in other places. It looks like I've got a couple of questions, so I'm gonna. Okay, clarification on previous question. How differently do people behave when the impact of the decision on people they know? I see. Okay, well, so I think still we have that concept. That would be trickier to get to in a lab experiment, but I think you could do it. If you took people from, you can imagine doing that in terms of games around regions. So you have Americans making decisions in war games about America. You have people from a specific state making decisions about their own state versus, say, resolving conflict in their own state versus resolving conflict with another state. That's an interesting question. I'd love to talk about it more offline, because I think that that's something that we could get at. The question really is the intersection there between, like, in real conflict research, how does that come up versus in games, and is there a significant difference? And so, we have to design some studies to test it, but I am a big believer that we can design studies to test almost anything. Doing non-real actions outside the bounds of them, specifically it reveals vulnerability. It may have some value, and that has, there's a trade-off there, because if something reveals a vulnerability, and I'm talking here about the idea that we need to get these games to places that need them. But as these games reveal vulnerabilities, that also represents a risk. So I think it's a balance that we have to strike. If I'm not understanding this particular comment, please feel free to elucidate, and we'll hopefully put it up in the green bubble form. I see. Oh, yes. Huh. We wargame about people to whom few of these justice issues are applied. I assume by this that we're talking about the fact that we wargame about soldiers, and we wargame about people outside the scope of U.S. law. So the first part of that is, it is true that military personnel give up a lot of their rights in the process of signing up for the military, right? That we still have some unalienable rights, but there's a lot that as members of the military that people no longer control, about their lives, about their personal choices. However, we as human subjects participants are still required to adhere to the terminology and the edicts of this. So I'm not saying that we should design war games where everybody gets an equal share. I'm not saying that we should design war games where everyone gets credit according to their individual effort. I'm talking about the benefits of our research have to be applied in that way, and our participants need to be rewarded. And that's something that's true whether they're military or not, whether or not they are U.S. participants or not, because it's the law. And so that's not like a personal statement that I'm making. That's a statement that's made by the Belmont Report. That's why they prohibited some kinds of research using prisoners, and it would be equally true if military participants don't have a choice about what they're doing. And the second part, where we're talking about people outside the U.S., I mean, even if we're doing work outside the U.S., there's many sort of sub-documents around the Belmont Report about how we have to apply those things to participants there. So again, this is about the construction of the research, the application of, the relevance of the research to research participants, and then the fruits of the research going back into the communities that drove that research and contributed to that research. So I'm not making the argument that the games themselves have to show this kind of justice, but rather that the fruits of the games have to. I hope that clears that up. I'm going to move on to the next slide, but we will come back to any questions. So one of the places where the community is really working to have, to apply justice to sort of the left side of the game design process is the Derby House Principles. And so I'm not going to read you the Derby House Principles. I'm sure that you're all familiar with it. But basically, they are a set of principles that were designed to promote inclusion and diversity in professional wargaming. And so that works through standards, opportunities, and access. And it talks about the fact that we're going to oppose people who signed on to the Derby House Principles are going to oppose racism, sexism, homophobia, and other discrimination. And look for ways to kind of scaffold or support underrepresented groups in our professional activities. We also want to listen to the concerns and suggestions of our colleagues and demonstrate our commitment through ongoing assessments. Not everybody's doing these things, not everybody's signed on to these things, but this is kind of something that was put forward by members of the wargaming community to really try and make our sort of the left side of wargaming, the side where we're in a room sitting down and a wargame has not yet been created, and then as we start to talk about those things, so it was sort of embedding some diversity and therefore to a certain extent some concepts of justice, or at least ideally some concepts of justice into the work. However, these are not intended to address the need for justice in design. Right? So these are about justice within the community. They're about inclusion and diversity. They're about standards for ethical wargame community building. And they're very important. I'm not minimizing their importance, but if we go back up to the Belmont Report, we specifically need justice in the design of our research in terms of how the participants are included, how they're rewarded, and so forth. And so I want to highlight that this is necessary or useful in the community, but is not sufficient to get to where we need to be in order to really fully apply the Belmont Report principles. Any questions about that? Okay, so ethics, aspects of ethics or justice in the wargame. Well, so I think that part of the conversation there is about who you include. Part of it is around designing so that the games are reflective of reality, but that when we discuss what reality they're reflective of, we're including multiple voices in there. But there are also going to be some specific design concerns that I have, and I'm going to get to this in a moment. So this is the first kind that I'm concerned about. And I'm concerned about a number of different aspects of wargaming that may have ethical implications. And when I say they have ethical implications, I mean, there's a whole host of ways that ethics can arise in wargaming, but one of them is this aggregation phenomenon. So I've talked about gamers mode. There are some other names for it. There's a warriors terminology around it, warrior's mind, I think it is. But it's this idea that you game the game to win at all costs. It's characterized as you might imagine, by really aggressive play. And these are the folks who come to your war game and they need to beat it. And I don't mean that they need to beat it in the way that we would love for everyone to be engaged in our game. I mean that they need to beat it at all costs. So if they can game the system, if they can game the game mechanics rather than develop good strategies to win, if they can overwhelm the white cell, if they can do things of that sort, then they will disrupt the game. And so it exploits game rules in an unrealistic manner. It might use aspects of the environment. A gamer's mode person might even cheat. And I say that like, it's such a surprise that people might cheat at a game. When we're talking about Monopoly and you're playing with your cousins, that's probably not a surprise. But when you're talking about expert participants in a war game, it seems a little surprising to me that people might cheat, but people get really involved in games, and that's wonderful until we get into this mode. So there are things that you can do to control for gamers mode. I mean, one of the things is you can observe and ask questions. There are some surveys that you can ask about gaming and winning, some questions, although I do think that we could probably develop a psychometric evaluation for gamers mode that would be quite useful. But that aside, why do we care? So, it might screw up somebody's experience of the game, sure. But, we've all had a bad game of Monopoly or Risk or, God forbid, diplomacy, right? So why does it matter from an ethical perspective worthy of a conversation in a setting like this? Well, play against participants in gamers mode has a couple of really scary things. One is that if we have a bunch of decision makers in a room and they're consistently playing against, with groups that have a gamers mode present, then they may learn to believe that adversaries are going to be more aggressive than it in fact is true. Going back up to the comment that somebody had earlier, like, yeah, it's absolutely true that people act differently when bullets are live, right? I mean, when they're real bullets, you make different choices. And so people may be more aggressive in game simulations than they are in real life. Another problem, though, is not just those individual games with those individual participants, but the whole point of having all these games, right, is to build models, is to create theory, is to test possible strategies. And so you can wind up with models built from sessions that have a gamers mode problem that incorporate those unrealistic levels of aggression and escalation, such that we are now making decisions based on findings that are inaccurate, that lead us into a world where we're assuming that other people are going to attack, so we preemptively attack in a way that's really scary because it's not real. One of my colleagues, Jason Reinhardt, talks a lot about shared futures and the idea that we have this fictional future that we share, whether it's about what a nuclear war would be like, or or what a bad cyber attack might be like. And to the extent that we have these shared fictions that we work on together, then we can create norms. But here we're talking about a potential shared future where it's not based on what people would actually do, but both groups or one group believes that the other group is going to be aggressive in a way that they might not actually be. There are mitigations for this. So one is that you just shouldn't build a game that can only be won by aggression. There should be incentives and disincentives to aggression, because there are incentives and disincentives for aggression in real life. Pre and post game surveys of player motivation are useful. Post game debriefs are useful. All of these things can get at aggregation. I see a comment here in the sidebar. The unengaged gamer may conversely teach a participant that an adversary may be less aggressive than in real life. I think unengaged gamers can teach people almost anything. I mean, I don't know, I have a lot of game experience over the years, and I've definitely seen unengaged people attack at random or withdraw at random, be less aggressive, be more aggressive, be incomprehensibly aggressive, which is which is, I think, perhaps the greatest danger for unengaged gamers, because we're all sitting here looking at a global strategy, and then somebody hies off and attacks a country that's completely unrelated to the dynamics. Like that's shocking, and leads to people reevaluating strategies in a way that can be very counterproductive, right? Suddenly people feel like they have to control areas that otherwise, that in a normal situation wouldn't be up for grabs. I will also say, though, that sometimes having a few less engaged or less experienced players can sometimes simulate new states or new leadership within states where people maybe don't have the experience that an existing body of advisors, a stable body of advisors might provide support and stability for a nation. And those aren't always present, right? We've definitely seen moments in history where novice leadership, or where sort of radically different leadership without the same state institutional support have made choices that seem irrational, but that follow a certain internal characteristic. But yeah, unengaged gamers are a potential hardship, although I would argue that they fall all over the map. I've definitely seen that. I would be interested to see if other people agree with the commenter that unengaged gamers may be less aggressive, because I'm not sure why they would necessarily be less aggressive versus just haphazardly aggressive and non-aggressive as the whim takes them. In addition to aggro aggregation, oh wait, here's another question that I find very interesting. Yes, successfully gaming the game or cheating tells us something about problems with game design. It absolutely does. In the large-scale hobby games that I ran for a long time before winding up in this career, we learned a lot from gaming the game and cheating. It shows us imperfections in the game design, which doesn't mean that they're always solvable, right? Like there are elements of this where we do have to agree. We as a community, and then we as the participants, we gather to play these games, that cheating or gaming the game tells us about problems with game design, but sometimes they're not solvable problems with game design. They're just a mechanic of how games work. And so you really do have to develop some form of trust between you and your player group in order to test more complicated scenarios where it may seem to have a benefit to cheating, but at the end of the day, we're not learning anything if what they're doing is just gaming the system. Think about like a video game, board game, if I can hack the code to give me infinite tanks, that doesn't actually tell us anything about the scenarios in the real world, but it does give us an opportunity to improve, and I think that is worthwhile. Would you continue to play with, so there's another question, would you continue to play with or promote the cheater as being creative? I would not. Let me be clear. I think that the conversations in these cases are very useful. And the conversation that needs to be had there, I would feel, would probably be around the purpose of the work that we do. I really feel like if you have cheaters, your consent forms may not be great. And this is a thing that we as an organization, we as a community may not do a great job of. I think human subjects research in general writes incredibly long, boring consent forms, which is fine sometimes. But when we're doing something as interesting and complex as wargaming, you really want people to understand the stakes. And so if I come to you and I say, hey, will you be a participant in this game? It could influence how we make decisions about this kind of conflict, and you're still cheating, I would potentially sit down with them and say, hey, this doesn't actually help, because you're not cheating in the sense of creating like a pocket battleship or something. Like, you're cheating in the sense of exploiting game rules or hiding cards or something, and that's not helpful. Now, if they are doing something that exposes a possible strategy that you just didn't include, then honestly, I would tend to invite them to come to earlier design sessions, because sometimes people who like to break games turn out to be great game designers. So another kind of problem that I think that we have or potentially can have, is historical and ahistorical biases. And this is something that we found in our group, and I would be curious if other people have found it. Basically, that when signifiers are aligned, by signifiers I mean something like a map or a color on a map, like a map shape, the way that that a meeple or token looks, the framing of something, so that it's it's combat over water or whatever, the shape of the little planes that you design, if you're designing little plane tokens to be moved around. Any kind of signifier can be aligned to a historical country or time period, and players can sometimes adopt strategies based on those historical contexts. So, we saw it definitely both in terms of when we put a large country, like a big, vast country to the north. I guess it's over here on the screen, but that people started playing that large country as Russia. When we put a red versus blue, we similarly had people playing those countries and playing those sides of the game based on a certain assumption about what strategy would be like in the real world. But you even get this in terms of ahistorical bias with games that have, for instance, like the background map here is a map of the Lord of the Rings. There's a wonderful Lord of the Rings asymmetrical game out there, and it's fun to play. But when you're playing even a war game in our kind of setting for our kinds of research, you can find that people will take something like there's a mountainous country to the east and I have to get my troops over there, and they will start playing it as though that country is the bad guy in kind of a Lord of the Rings setting. People will apply heuristics and past understanding to almost anything, and so that's really hard to account for because you don't necessarily have the same background as your players. And so you might look at something and go, oh, that's clearly the Balkans. And they might look at something and go, oh, that's clearly Game of Thrones. And so that can be really tricky. And the implications for that is that, we may wind up developing strategies for the future that perpetuate old conflict behaviors, not because they're relevant to, say, the new tools that we have, but just because that's what the map looks like. Or conversely, with ahistorical play, we might reify unrealistic or unproductive conflict approaches just because that's how people are thinking about it. And so that's a really hard one to deal with, but careful design is important, as is ample pre-experimentation of all the player-facing signifiers. So if I'm talking about maps, I'm talking about meeples, I'm talking about tokens, all of those things, because people have a funny way of deciding that this is clearly whatever is from their previous background. And so I find that we have found that to be a surprisingly common challenge, and one that I don't see written up in the literature very much, but I do think that it's worth noting. There are some wonderful map generators out there, and so you can kind of come up with mini maps and see which one is best suited and least likely to cause these problems. And same with the tokens and things like that. Having relatively neutral tokens can sometimes be beneficial, but also just having things that look a little bit fantastic, but not in a pre-existing way can be a good idea, a good way of handling this as well. Any questions about historical or ahistorical biases? All right. So finally, in terms of the sort of big three that I promised I was going to talk about in this talk, consent, model building, and the Ender's Game conundrum is the name of this slide. And for those of you who have not read Ender's Game, I apologize for spoilers, but it's been around for a long, long time. So hopefully you're all familiar with at least this core conceit. So players consent to play our games, and I talked a moment ago about how our consents aren't always great. But basically, the argument that I'm having here, or the concern that I'm having here, is that there's an assumption of bounded applications. So we give them a consent, and we say, this is going to be used in this way by these people. And our players frequently have a limited understanding of what their role really is and the possible impacts, especially in non-experts. So we promise them no more than minimal harm, but then we work as hard as we can to create really useful theory with the work that they've done, with with the results of the experiments. Well, so what is true about useful theory, right? Useful theory moves outside its initial discipline, almost always. If we learn something new about conflict research that we're trying to apply to this tiny subset, we wind up applying it across other areas. And then, if we find out something fundamental about human behavior and how humans resolve conflicts, then that goes, everywhere. It goes to to international relations, poli-sci, but then it also goes to psychology potentially. So we are on the one hand working towards highly generalizable, very interesting theoretical findings, and on the other hand, we're promising our participants that the stuff that they do will have some impact, but not huge impact, is kind of how I usually see it framed in the consent documents. And so that's a potential inaccuracy. On top of that, there's a real potential mismatch between the player attachment to their actions and the potential ramifications if a theory goes wild, right? Like if, and I kind of think about it from the perspective of, I'm sure you've all heard of the Stanford Prison experiment, and nobody wants to be the researcher that accidentally does that to anybody, right? We don't want to be the people who say, just play the game however you feel is appropriate, try and win, use whatever strategies you need to, and then suddenly strategies are being applied in international contexts, and the players feel as though they are part of something that they didn't sign on for. Influential cases have lasting impacts. I mean, people who are in the Stanley Milgram experiment continue to be asked to give interviews about their respective roles. And while we haven't had that problem, we could. So we really need to think about how we phrase our consent forms. And I would argue that there's a few things that we can do about that. One is we can acknowledge potential impact if our findings are influential. So, for the most part, probably this is going to be fairly constrained unless we find some sort of fundamental, important theoretical advancement, at which point it could spread. If we just say that in the consent form, then we have done, in a way that is comprehensible, then we've done our due diligence. Narrative consent documents, I think, could go a long way here. We can tell them a little more rather than just using this sort of boilerplate organizational, incredibly dry approach that people can gloss over or not always understand. And then finally, not to bang the drum of the thing I care about, but experimental game design can help with this because of the higher end. So, if you have one session or one or two sessions in a qualitative setting, in a TTX that winds up being influential, then that has a different burden on those few people playing versus if you have 100 or 200, or I think Signal wound up with like 400 something participants, and so you wind up with a different kind of feeling of responsibility from the players. I see a comment here, and I'm reading it. Yeah, I mean, that's an interesting concept. I like that, the true versus the real game. But I would also, though, like to point out that sometimes we don't control whether or not people bring context in. So true games may require context, but the real games may require context, and true games may not. But you may try and design a true game and wind up with different results because people bring their own reality into it, and that's a side effect of playing with human subjects, right? So one of the final things that I really wanted to bring up here is we're in this great community. We've got a conference full of people who are engaged on this topic. Ethical design and ethical gaming is part of, it's the conference header. That's an amazing and unusual thing. So I feel that there's this opportunity for us to collaborate on a research agenda, on a research plan for ethical gaming that could be really impactful. I've identified here some opportunities. I've talked about laboratory effects, influence of signifiers on player behavior is one example of this, but there are many laboratory effects that we could study in more detail to get at, to get both at the defensibility and credibility of war games, but also to identify where we do have some weaknesses. Where we know laboratory effects, we could do research about how to mitigate and how those mitigations work. We could design tools to test for their presence. I think it would be useful to codify play styles and player motivations so that we could look more deeply at that, and that would allow us to look at some of the ethical implications of combining different motivation types, in addition to being able to combine motivation types in order to see how it affects play. Community guidelines for applying Belmont principles to wargame research, I think, is something that would be worthwhile. And I'm thinking here sort of something that's a consensus document similar to the Derby House rules, but with guidelines specifically around how wargaming should implement and assess aspects of the Belmont Report, including, of course, justice, which I think is where our weakness is at the moment. And then finally, unsurprisingly, I would love to keep having these conversations. So, any continued exploration of ethics considerations in wargaming is valuable and interesting. And I would love to see more of that over this year, over this conference, and just in the future. I'm also available for any kind of conversations that you would like to have offline, and the Discord is open. So we've got about 5 minutes left if people have questions or comments that they would like to share.
Hi, Ruby. It's Anne. Thank you for a great discussion. There's no unanswered questions in the chat room, so I will take this opportunity to ask. Early on in your presentation, you talked about developing large end data sets through wargaming. Mm-hmm. And I have a concern that with the onset of, all this data science, data analytics, and everybody, quote, is getting into data analytics and creating all this data. What type of bias could be put into the design of a war game that we don't even really know about through these large data sets? And is there something that we need to put into these data sets that could help us understand if it's a correct context or not?
So sorry. Yeah, so in answer to that, I think that machine learning and ethical data analysis are a passion of mine. And so I think that when we discuss how we're going to look at large end wargame data sets, those questions and all the questions that we have around how to do that kind of analysis come into play. However, when we look at machine learning and data science, we're usually talking about huge data sets, right? So what's needed to analyze like a 400-person war game is not really the same guy. Like, we don't need machine learning to analyze a 400-person war game. That's a regression analysis. That's, you can see like an ANOVA. That's not the same scale. I do think that there's a possibility in the long term that we get there. And if we do get there, it's very important that we start looking at our data early on to see ways in which bias might exist within our data sets. So I'm fascinated by the idea that we can move to the left, some of those concerns, so that as we structure our data collection, that we can flag things that might create bias within the game, within the data analysis. And so, yeah, but I do think that's a valid concern. As I said, it's so low end right now that I don't think that it's particularly relevant. But once we moved into, say, if we had a truly massively multiplayer war game, then it would be relevant. And I think it is important. My advice is always to develop test cases as early as possible that will test your edge cases, and then to continue to be attentive to this.
Excellent. Well, thank you. It looks like we are at the end of our hour. What a great session. Thanks for all the great questions. And there's plenty of other comments, so I hope you get a chance to go into the Discord channel and see them. A number of folks have said they wanted to talk to you offline as well. So thank you again, Dr. Ruby
Love that.
Booth. And we will see you later on, I'm sure, in the conference. And thank you to everyone else for joining our session.
Thank you, Anne, so much. Thank you, Dawn, for being a producer in the background, and thank you to Connections and my audience for being here and talking about something that I care about. So have a great day.